A quick disclaimer before today's JACO report on the execution of convicted killer Reginald Clemens. Late Friday, a federal court granted Clemens a stay of execution, putting it on hold for the time being. The JACO report was taped prior to the court granting the stay. Here's Charles.
Welcome to the JACO report. I'm Charles JACO. Reggie Clemens' life has been extended, apparently, by a technicality. Julie Carey and Robin Carey never got that same chance. Clemens was supposed to have been executed June 17th for the murder of the two Carey sisters. They were raped and murdered and then thrown from the old Chain of Rocks bridge into the Mississippi River in 1991. A federal appeals court here in St. Louis put the execution on hold Friday. They did not give a reason, but it's widely supposed that Clemens' lethal injection is on hold until a federal court in Kansas City rules on one of Clemens' court filings. And in that case, Clemens' lawyers want the execution stopped, not because they're pleading Clemens is not guilty, but because Missouri's lethal injection may be cruel and unusual punishment and therefore unconstitutional. It's not that Reggie Clemens does not claim to be innocent. Quite the contrary. He and his lawyers and his family and leading civil rights groups all say Clemens is not guilty of murder. So if he does get the needle, eventually will Missouri be executing an innocent man, or will his death be the perfect punishment for a man convicted of helping torture and kill the Carey sisters 18 years ago? Today on the JACO report, we talk about the Carey murders, the Clemens case, and the death penalty in Missouri. April 4th, 1991, Robin and Julie Carey take their cousin from Washington, D.C., Thomas Clemens, out on the old Chain of Rocks bridge to read a poem the sisters had painted on the structure. On the way, they ran into four men: Marlon Gray, Antonio Richardson, Daniel Winfrey, he's the white man on the right, and Reggie Clemens.
After we passed them on the bridge, we talked to them and then we left. Because we had lost the flashlight, so we couldn't see anything up there.
Within an hour, the Carey sisters were pushed or thrown from the bridge. Julie Carey's body was recovered 130 miles south of St. Louis 3 weeks later. Robin Carey's body was never found. At first, police liked the cousin, Tom Clemens, for the murder. In fact, they liked him a lot. One reason: Tom Clemens claimed to have been tossed into the river, too. Cops doubted he could have survived a 60-foot fall like that. And there was one other small matter. Tom Clemens confessed.
Clemens never confessed with any detail or any whatsoever. He blurted out in the middle of an interrogation, "Okay, I did it," and then recanted shortly thereafter.
After that, police shifted their attention to the quartet of Marlon Gray, Antonio Richardson, Daniel Winfrey, and Reggie Clemens. Each one of them had a story to tell.
All these people came in on each other, first of all, and in separate interviews out of each other's hearing, they each corroborated what the other guy was saying.
Based on that, the prosecution's case went something like this. Richardson, Gray, and Clemens took turns raping the sisters while Winfrey helped hold them. The girls were then pushed off the bridge while the cousin, Clemens, was forced to jump 60 feet to the water. And how did it all come out? Antonio Richardson found guilty, sentenced to death. The sentence commuted to life without parole. Daniel Winfrey, sentenced to 30 years. He served 15. He's now out on parole. Marlon Gray, sentenced to death, executed in 2005. And Reggie Clemens, due to die this month. So, where's the problem? Clemens supporters claim he confessed only after being beaten by police.
The reason that I did confess was because that's the only way they was going to let me up out of there alive. That's how I felt at the time.
That's ridiculous. I categorically deny that. It's absurd.
Things got even weirder when Tom Clemens, the girl's cousin, claimed he had originally confessed because the cops beat him, too. Clemens got a $150,000 settlement from the city. Then there were charges of prosecutorial misconduct. A federal court overturned Clemens' death sentence in 2002, but a federal appeals court reinstated it. And while Clemens and his supporters say he is an innocent man, cops and prosecutors think not.
I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever.
I'm real nervous about being executed simply because I know they will execute innocent people.
Coming up, the Reggie Clemens case and the death penalty. Joining us now to talk about the Clemens case and to talk about the death penalty are two gentlemen we're glad to have with us. First is Nels Moss. Nels was the prosecutor in the Clemens case. Nels, thank you very much for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
Also with us, Redditt Hudson. Redditt is with the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union of Eastern Missouri. Redditt, thanks for coming on board.
Glad to be here.
All right, for those of us who were not here in 1991 when this case took place, of all the evidence that was there one, what was the most damning piece of evidence in your mind against Reggie Clemens in this case?
The most damning piece of evidence, in my opinion, was how he was connected through his cousin, Antonio Richardson, who had stolen a flashlight which had a specific name on it, Horn 1. When the police located the owner of that flashlight, after he gave the name of Antonio Richardson, who then in turn gave the names of the other individuals who then were taken into custody and gave statements implicating themselves in a rape and robbery scheme, but each denying that they individually had murdered the young ladies, Julie and Robin Carey.
Now, so what order was this trial in? In other words, there were four individuals. Was this the first trial? Was this the third? How did?
It was the second trial. Marlon Gray was tried in October of '92, and he was found guilty and received the death penalty. Next came Reginald Clemens, and last in February of '93, and then last came Antonio Richardson later that year.
So basically the testimony against all of these guys, the damning testimony was what, out of the mouths of the other people? In other words, they all implicated one another?
No, primarily it was the cousin of the two young ladies who survived, Tom Cummins, Daniel Winfrey, who was a co-participant in part of these activities, and their own statements.
Redditt, where is the problem here? When we hear, justice for Reggie Clemens, I mean, does this mean that you guys at the ACLU believe that Reggie Clemens is completely innocent of everything and we're about to execute an innocent man?
Yes, and it's not just the people at the ACLU, but it is an entire community of humane and just people. The first problem with what he just said is the statements that Reggie Clemens and Marlon Gray gave. They were beaten out of him. I have the transcript that he gave to Internal Affairs, or the interview from Internal Affairs, describing how his confession was beaten out of him by the two officers that interviewed him the day he was interviewed by them.
Now, when you say
he did never confess to murder. He never did. They wanted him to, so instead he confessed to rape. And the reason he did that was so that the beating would stop. He was never tried on the rape charges. He was never tried on the rape, but they were used to attach him to the murder. Wait a minute. They were used to attach him to the murder, and that's what made him eligible for capital punishment. How do we execute someone who was never tried on the charges because they were dropped by this man because he knew he could improve them? Okay,
Nels, what about that? And what about, first off, the idea, and we've heard this from Clemens before, that this confession was coerced or beaten out of him. One of the investigating officers we talked to, Mike Guzzi, said that's absolutely ridiculous. What do you say?
I'm glad you brought that up. Thanks.
I would indicate that the Internal Affairs Division interviewed all of these participants, interviewed them at length, took pictures. I obtained medical records from the jail with reference to this, and while they had some injuries that were minor, some swelling of a cheek or something, they could have easily, according to the medical records, occurred after police custody. To say that the police would beat them up to a certain extent to obtain rape and robbery statements and say, okay, that's enough, we won't beat them any further for murder statements, I think is a little ludicrous.
So you're denying that there was any physical abuse?
Okay, let me say this. The judge at Reggie's arraignment thought that his injuries were severe enough to send him to the hospital to be treated for them. That's how serious his injuries were. And to say that is absurd for Mike Guzzi, of all people, who was in proximity to this investigation. Mike should know that his own client, Thomas Cummins, who was initially charged with the deaths of his sisters, alleged the same thing and got a six-figure settlement for it. How the hell do we justify his claim being settled for money and deny the claims of guys who had obvious physical injuries when Thomas Cummins didn't have a scratch on him? His case is an egregious example of a corrupted process.
Let me back up a second. Let's talk about Tom Cummings. This was the cousin of the Carey sisters, and initially he had confessed, and the cops at the very beginning liked him for this. How did that proceed? I wasn't here in '91, so I don't know how that proceeded. How did they determine that, well, this is a bogus confession, we're going to drop this line of investigation and move on?
Well, first of all, Tom Cummins was with them, with the police officers, for a period of 15 to 20 hours after this event, after he came out of the river, after he had seen his two cousins killed by being pushed off the bridge. And while he indicated that they pressured him, when the police applied, the only thing they told me they had, and as it turns out I think that they ever had, was, well, if you said I did it, then I did it. And that was the extent of it. Now, later on, some other stories supposedly that he had said surfaced. But the one statement that he made that could be relied on, in my opinion, is his tape statement, just as the tape statements of the suspects. In his tape statement, he specifically described the four individuals involved, height, weight, everything, remembered a couple of their names. He indicated how the crime happened, and that statement of his, original statement of his, was corroborated by every other person, every other suspect that was interviewed. And nothing here. And the one point is, if he is totally innocent of this, where was his alibi? Where was some witness to say he was elsewhere? We had witnesses leading.
Because he was on the bridge doesn't make him guilty. How long are you going to let him go on now?
Well, I'll tell you what. We're going to take a break right now, and when I come back, we're going to continue this discussion about the case of Reggie Clemens and the death penalty in the state of Missouri. Stay with us, please. The Jaco Report will be right back. Welcome back to the Jaco Report, continuing our discussion of the case of Reggie Clemens and the death penalty with former prosecutor Nels Moss and Redditt Hudson from the ACLU. Look, Redditt, if this guy, meaning Reggie Clemens, was on the bridge in the company of these other guys, you said earlier that doesn't necessarily make him guilty. Hold on a second. But then why? I mean, he claims he was, a confession was beaten out of him.
That's right.
The cops at the time indicated that his statements and the other three guys pretty much corroborated each other in terms of exactly what happened.
If you read this document that is his testimony to an internal affairs officer, he was given that testimony to read. They wrote it out for him. No wonder it's consistent when you beat guys in separate rooms and tell them what to say. But back to Cummins' original statement, saying that the most reliable statement he made was the one that he gave about these guys. The most reliable statement he gave was the one that the police challenged him on. It was reliable because it showed his duplicity. He says that he jumped off a bridge, damn near 10 stories, struck the water at 80 miles an hour, stayed in that water 30 or 40 minutes, swam upstream past the water treatment plant where the current is so dangerous that they don't even attempt rescues there, comes out of the river completely dry from the waist up, hair neatly combed in place. The police, the initial investigators, told him, son, that's BS. And they gave him a polygraph, which came back as deceptive. That was his most reliable statement. And that's when he broke down and told the truth, that it was me who was responsible.
All right,
but then these defendants became available because in St. Louis, race was introduced into the context of the overall crime. You got rape, you got race, and now you have these innocent guys who have been, one wrongfully executed and one scheduled to die because of a corrupted process.
So you're telling me this entire thing was because three of the four alleged perps were black and the cousin was white?
I'm telling you that those facts and circumstances made themselves available to people who were willing to corrupt this process at the expense of innocent lives, and more importantly, at the expense for justice for Robin and Julie Carey. Everyone who is an advocate for Reggie now is deeply empathetic to the Carey family's situation. Who wants to see two young girls who, by all accounts, were wonderful human beings suffer this way?
Nels, how convinced are you that Clemens is guilty, the other guys involved in this were guilty, that some sort of mistake wasn't made? Are you 100% certain?
100%. There's no question. Every extrinsic fact. For example, the statement of Marlon Gray indicated that he had participated in the rape, that Reggie had participated in the rape, that Antonio Richardson had. He had told, all four of these gentlemen were together before this incident happened at another individual's house, and they said, we're going to the Chain of Rocks Bridge. So we have confirmation they were there, they were going there, and their statement said, we were there. Then their statements indicate who each was present, who else was present. They indicate also that they had a flashlight. As I talked to you about this flashlight, that's what led to Antonio Richardson, which led to the rest of them. To say, what was he doing here? There was no testimony that he was just ambling down the bridge and he knew nothing about this and they knew nothing about this, and it was some totally separate group of individuals who did it.
Thomas Clemens was responsible. You keep talking about statements. They were coerced statements.
Okay, well,
and let me say this.
Wait.
You're talking about
wait a minute.
You're talking about extrinsic facts. What about
wait a minute.
Facts?
You're willing to say that Reginald Clemens was beaten and a statement was forced out of him, and it's unreliable. But on the other hand, you're saying, well, a statement was beaten out of Tom Clemens,
no,
but
I'm
is
telling
reliable.
you this. Let me step on that. No, listen. Thomas Clemens was never beaten. This is the next step in that equation. His father was present in the next room when he was being questioned, and he had an attorney to respond while he was being questioned. So wait,
not there.
What I'm telling you is that he was not beaten, and that settlement that they gave him is in effect paid false testimony. Now let's talk about forensic facts. What about the fact that the coroner, Michael Graham, testified that there was no evidence of rape at trial, and we could have had
on a body in the water for 3 weeks?
Whatever. No, but we could have had the clothes. They could have tested the clothes. The clothes came up missing. Who had them in custody, chain of custody last?
They were stripped from the woman. What was left on her was so water-soaked that nothing
What happened to it?
It happened to it. Nothing was found on it. Nobody ever asked for it. Nothing was found on it.
Nobody ever asked for it. Okay.
So,
had the defense asked for it, it was theirs.
Tell me this. In your mind, not only have you got the right people, in your mind, the death penalty is an appropriate punishment here?
Extremely appropriate.
Why, in the Richardson case, was his commuted to life without parole?
Because the state of the law was such that it said only a jury could give the death penalty, and they therefore couldn't agree, and they turned it over to the judge, and the judge gave the young man the death penalty. So the Supreme Court said, no, that can't happen.
Redditt, if you're saying the entire system is corrupted, I mean, you must mean that literally. Well, in this case, simply because this has gone through not only the trial process, not only all of these documents, but appeals processes that are mandated after a capital punishment case, and in every one of them, they upheld the basic finding.
A federal court overturned Reggie's death sentence because he found that this man had unconstitutionally excluded black jurors from the jury pool. Correct or incorrect?
Incorrect, because the Court of Appeals said
overturned you for unconstitutionally excluded
You
jurors.
Conveniently remember the district court, but you conveniently don't remember the Court of Appeals that said the district court judge was wrong, and that didn't occur.
Which brings me to my next point.
Which is?
The current governor of this state was the Attorney General at the time that all of this was taking place. He worked to get that death penalty reinstated after it was correctly ruled by that federal court that this guy was unconstitutional. You're talking about a guy who at the time of this case was running for circuit attorney. He had that to use for leverage. You know, he thought he had a great case to catapult him in his office and got whooped anyway.
We're about out of time. What I want to close this out on is something we talked about before in terms of the death penalty itself. You're saying this Clemens guy is about to be executed.
That's right.
He's an innocent man.
I'm saying.
I take it this would speak very strongly to the ACLU's belief that the death penalty
not
is
only
not
the
appropriate.
ACLU, but an increasing number of sane and just people across this country. We know we get it wrong. More than 130 people have been exonerated from death row after having been sentenced to die at the hands of their respective states. We know we get it wrong. How do we continue a process where situations like this, whether it's human error or out and out corruption, cost somebody's life who was innocent. We cannot persist in that. As a sane and just society, I say that we have to find either a better way to deal with serious crimes and violent crimes, or we have to stop at least and take a look at our process until we can find a way to eliminate error, which I don't think is possible.
Nels is a former prosecutor. Death penalty, good idea, bad idea?
It's an essential idea. I don't know that you'd characterize it as good or bad. I think it's necessary to have the ultimate penalty to punish those that commit the worst crimes and are the worst individuals that are in the system. You cannot withdraw from society the possibility of punishing someone as severely as they have a crime they committed. You cannot remove from society the ultimate sanction. That'd be like saying, with diplomats, okay, let's engage in diplomacy, and when that fails, that's all. Forget about it. We can't do anything else.
You can remove it if it inevitably means that we're going to execute innocent people.
And you're convinced that's what's going on in this case, and you're convinced it's not.
There is, it's nice to talk about the history of other jurisdictions. In the state of Missouri, there is no evidence that anyone actually innocent has ever been put to death.
Marlon Gray.
Well, as I said, no evidence of it.
Yeah.
Tell you what,
false evidence that you presented at trial.
We're going to wrap it up on that. Stay with us. We'll be back with some final thoughts on the Jaco Report right after this. Welcome back. The family of Robin and Julie Carey don't want to have anything to do with stories about Reggie Clemens or indeed any of the convicted killers, and we can't blame them. Reggie Clemens' mother, meanwhile, has asked Missouri Governor Jay Nixon for clemency. As Attorney General, Nixon wanted to fast-track the Clemens execution. It's unlikely he's changed his mind since he's become governor. So Clemens' fate right now is in the hands of the federal courts. And if they decide lethal injection is cruel and unusual, Clemens lives. If not, he dies. We just don't know when yet. Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you back here next week on the Jaco Report.